So, good afternoon, everybody, or good evening if you are in Asia, or good morning if you are in South America. And I see we have some guests from South America as well. We're live here on Zoom. I'm Pietro Paganini, and I'm very glad and proud to host the Free Market Row show and the digital event that we are running with the Austrian Economics Center and Competere. And we were supposed to meet a few weeks ago in the beautiful city of Rome, where I'm based right now. But, you know, something has happened in between, and therefore we're not here physically. But in March, with the team in Austria, in Vienna, with Scott, Barbara, Victoria, Britt, and Martin, we decided, why don't we go live? Why don't we take advantage of the technology? And so we did, and we did a great round. Let's call it the first season. Webinars, 9 webinars, and we finished the first season, and then our audience said, okay, let's invest, let's go on Netflix, and we're back here with the second season. And the topic of today is, and it cannot be different, it's, you know, races basically, and what is happening right now around the world, and particularly in the US. And in fact, we have a great guest that is coming back, actually, was already in one of our webinars a few weeks ago. But, you know, we're liberals, and classical liberals, and not to confuse our American guests. And we believe in diversity. We believe in pluralism. And so when there is discussion about promoting diversity, we always be a bit concerned because it's part of our DNA. So when we saw this movement that is promoting diversity, but then a part of it sounds interested in promoting a specific type of a diversity and kind of imposing it in a sort of totalitarian way, then we get very much more concerned. So since I was very intrigued by this, and I thought as classical liberals, we should, you know, stand up and express our position and contribute again to the matter of diversity. And to be honest, I think that sometimes we are also to be blamed because probably we don't sufficiently and well express our position, and we let others interpret our position sometimes in a very negative and derogative and wrong way. So, you know, talking with the Austrian Economic, I said, why don't we challenge this topic? Why instead of just writing, you know, small op-eds or short op-eds, we don't also speak, and why don't we organize a debate? Because the best way, you know, to recognize diversity is also discussion, is the conflict, what we call as a democratic conflict that should develop more knowledge and provide chances to enhance knowledge. And so today we put together a beautiful, I have to say, a beautiful panel, because it's a very diverse panel. And when I think about diversity, it's not how people look like, but it's how people think and what kind of ideas people can bring to the table. So I have this, you know, 45 minutes we have, and we are going to be recorded. We are actually being recorded. We will be available forever. So anytime you want to watch us and you want to see me, I'm there forever. We are live on Facebook. And if you are on Facebook, don't forget you can join us on Zoom as well. And on Zoom, you can post questions. You can ask questions. You can chat with the speakers. And then you have the beautiful bios of our speakers on the great website of the Free Market Row Show, where you can see what they do and where they are, and of course you can interact with them anytime you want. So I want to thank the speakers. I want to thank our audience that is connecting slowly right now. I see some of them are on Facebook as well. And, you know, I put together the agenda today, and I want to start from Scott Nelson, that is actually directly speaking from Vienna and from the Austrian Economics, and then I will go with Stefan, and then with Mary Lucy, that is in Oxford. Stefan is in Frankfurt, and then we end our first round of talks with Sydney, that is in the beautiful Connecticut in the United States, and probably is the closest person to this movement. But as I said, it's not just in the United States, is basically everywhere. And we have also a kind of diversity movement, you know, Hong Kong as well, but not many people are talking about that. They prefer to talk about the one in the United States. So Scott, can you, you know, I had a few questions for you, but I want to start with a general question. What is happening, and how do you interpret what happens?
That's an awfully broad question, Pietro. Thank you for that. Well, let me launch into something equally broad then. You mentioned a lot about diversity and promotion of diversity. I mean, well, of course, we have to distinguish at least between two different kinds of diversity. There's, if you will, the more progressive sort of diversity, which is very focused on skin color or sexual orientation and that sort of thing. And then there's the other diversity to which you alluded in your opening, namely diversity of thought and opinion. But I'm not really sure if the movement, in other words, Black Lives Matter, if even by progressive standards, they're actually promoting diversity. I mean, if you look at their website, for example, diversity, the word diversity is conspicuously absent from their statement of beliefs on the website. As a movement, it seems to be rather flexible. It can mean whatever it needs to mean to different people who feel aggrieved. And its popular expression, though, the typical sorts of things you would expect to hear from people who believe in diversity, such as the calls for more Blacks, let's say, in positions of power, etc., have also been conspicuously absent. So I think, I mean, at its worst extreme, what we've seen in the last month, since it was a month ago exactly to today that George Floyd died, what we've seen in the last month with Black Lives Matter seems to be less concerned with elevating Blacks than with tearing down the system, which is itself viewed as racist, hence that term that's often bandied about nowadays, namely systemic racism. And I think that leads to a flurry of interesting questions. For one, if the problem is the system, say, can it be reformed from within? Or will any of the reforms that you attempt to make also be tinged with racism? What all, for that matter, is included in the system? I mean, is it a set of institutions or specific ways of thinking? Is it all of those things, or are all parts of the system equally racist, or are only some parts of the system more racist than others? The language that's being used, systemic racism, institutional racism, etc., is also interesting because of what it implies about responsibility and accountability. I mean, a system itself has no responsibility insofar as it's not a legal person. When someone accuses a system, then the accusation can be rather flexible. I mean, it can mean that you're accusing someone in power, or a particular group of people, or society as a whole. In other words, an indictment against all individuals in a society. And it's the very, I think, opacity of the movement and its goals that is, in some ways, its greatest strength. I mean, some of its website essentially reads like an intersectional manifesto, and this is the problem with equality of outcome as the standard. How do you know, namely, that if you've succeeded or if you're doing any better? There's an irony of the whole export of the Black Lives Matter movement around the world. I mean, here in Vienna a few weeks ago, we had about 50,000 protesters show up in one of the squares. It's ironic, though, because Black Lives Matter is born in a narrative that is very, very American, given its history of slavery and everything surrounding that. And so you've taken one of the most specific sorts of American narratives you could find and actually exported it all over the place. And yet at the same time, though, one of the reasons it has been able to be picked up in so many different countries is because every country has at least some instance of racism in its history to which it can point. And so there's a certain murky universalism about it that makes it very adaptable.
Do you, sorry to interrupt, and before moving on, but do you see a problem of racism right now? And how would you decline this racism? Because I have to say, and sorry if I make it very personal, but as an Italian, when I studied in Sweden, that is a beautiful country and I love it and I love everybody there, but I got some kind of, I was a privileged student, of course, a privileged kid, but I felt some form of racism, by being pointed as, an Italian, a pizza guy, the first Italian doing a PhD and not being a pizza guy. Is that racist?
Well, I mean, I would say that particular example does have some racism in it, insofar as there were certain expectations of how you should behave and think, given that you are an Italian. Now, the extent to which those sorts of expectations, with respect to you, actually, were detrimental to your studies and whatnot, I can't say. You'd have to tell me yourself. I mean, some forms of racism can be more severe than others. I mean, if you take, for example, I think that was one of the things that was so outrageous about the George Floyd case for so many people is that it demonstrated a flagrant and excessive abuse of power on the part of the very people, namely police officers, who are expected to protect us. So it infringed not only any sort of notion of equality of outcome, but equality before the law itself, which I think we as classical liberals hold very dear.
Thanks, Scott. I'm coming back to you, and thanks everybody that is joining, and thanks everybody that is following us on Facebook. Just a little change because the original idea was to go to Oxford, where Mary Lucy. So Stefan, apologize me if I'm coming afterwards, but Mary Lucia. Apologize. There's I have to say a racial distinction. There's something in the same DNA we have, Mary and myself. That's the being music. You know, Paganini was a great musician, so you're a great musician, or at least the history of music. Do you, Mary, being in Oxford and having a sort of privileged also view on the UK and being so much engaged with the academy as most of us are, first of all, what do you experience within the academy? And then do you think that this movement, as Scott was partly mentioning, is actually promoting diversity or not? Hold on, there's your mic off. Hold on, thanks. For a musician, having the microphone off is not good.
Within the academy, it has not been my personal experience of racism. I am aware that there are others who say otherwise. I am aware, both my siblings, just a little bit of background. I'm adopted. My parents are Caucasian, and I was adopted from Vietnam. I have two siblings also adopted from East Asian countries who are also musicians. And my brother has just finished his doctorate. My sister is finishing her master's in music. And I am aware that there have been incidents with them. My reservation on these is that I am not completely certain that the incidents that we have experienced can accurately be described as racism, as they also seem to me to have elements of class assumptions rather than skin color assumptions. And I have a very specific example that is outside of music relating to my family, and that is once when my sister and I were in high school, two neighbor children, both I call them children, they were actually our age, told us one day that we sounded more American every time they heard us. And I'm aware that my own accent is hard to place. I'll explain that. English is my first language. I was adopted as an infant, but my family and my siblings and I were all privately educated. And it comes out in our speech patterns. And so the funny thing about that is the two other girls had very thick regional accents. And there are two possible interpretations within modern society. The first is to assume that the girls were racist and were coming out of a racist household. But the second is to consider that the girls were simply uninformed, that they had, that in all probability, they had never been outside their home region. They had never been outside of their own social sphere. And that this limited their concept of what was or was not American. And I don't think under those circumstances we can call these types of things racism. Within the context of broader social movements, right now I don't know and hesitate to say where the effect they will have on the academy, or what effect the academy will have on these movements. As you are aware, there was there have been ongoing protests for Oriel College's statue of Cecil Rhodes to come down. Currently, I don't know exactly. I've heard rumors within the student body, but because they are rumors, I'm not going to repeat them. What the ultimate outcome of this will be, and I really don't know where these movements stand and how they relate within the academy.
Yeah, and we're experiencing this. I'm experiencing this in my academia life as well, where there is a constant request of apologizing. So I'm coming to Stefan. Stefan, you're based in Frankfurt right now, so you're in the core, the center of Europe. Do you think there is really a need of Americans or white Americans or Europeans to apologize for something? Do you think within different contexts like the academia, business as well, do you see there is a need for any apology, or you think that this movement, as Scott was correctly saying, is promoting a political agenda that has nothing really to do with the promotion of diversity? Mike?
Okay, so.
Wonderful.
So, thank you very much. I think these are so many very complex questions. Apologizing for what? Apologizing the nature of the Black Lives Movement, Black Lives Matters movement. I think it's quite difficult to frame it because the movement, there is no, let's say, interlocutor to talk with. As Scott mentioned earlier, it's a movement, it's a kind of nebulous movement. There's no chief, there's some website who tries to bring some very interesting topic, very burning topics. And I think this is where actually people should look. They should look beyond this artificial element around the topic to go to the point. Otherwise, we'll get distracted. And I think the reason why actually the movement get global and viral is because one point is that it's because it's coming from the US. And if we want to go on the political level, on the international political level, the reason why it's so important at global level and why the entire universe is looking at the US is because the US has been the last couple of decades fighting, conducting wars all over the world to protect minorities. This is very important. And then in their own countries, they have some minorities whose rights are not respected or allegedly not respected, but statistically it's true. Systemic racism is what also Scott talked about, and how to address it. This is why people are very concerned, because the chief-in-chief of human rights has issue on that point at home. And then secondly, the second reason why the Black Lives Movement, beyond all the topics around, which can be some critical, because yes, there's a crisis, and in any kind of crisis, you will have opportunists. It's like a rain, it's raining, a tornado. The farmers will find it very interesting because it's helpful for farming, but at the same time, it brings on the surface some very nasty things that were hidden, some dead body and all kinds of things. And I will see the situation like this. To come back to the second point regarding the delocalization of the movement, across US boundaries at very local level in Germany, everywhere in the world. It's the movement or the crisis at the moment is a kind of mirror that is projected in the face of every single societies to look into this mirror and to identify racism or any kind of xenophobia that people wanted to avoid. Germany acknowledged that there's an hashtag saying by uns out. That means we also have it. So now, and Austria, I don't know well actually the situation, but every country has a racism problem. Dubai, in Singapore, there's some racism, and even in Africa, in some countries, in the Maghreb countries, in Mauritania, where slavery still exists. And so I think this is an opportunity for every society to make its self-criticism about racism, and why, after so many years, we are still talking about it. It's just because some lives do not matter enough. And then we need to talk about it because in a situation of rule of law, this is most important to consider, because the rule of law guarantee equity for every citizen. And then if some citizens do not feel protected enough by the rule of law, then we have problem, and then we need to discuss it. And I think this is where the situation need to get channeled. So how we get to that point, why, and how to go out of this situation. For sure, any opportunity, because it's an opportunity to discuss it, and any opportunity might be exploited. And it's our task as liberal to channel the discussion also about it. How do we guarantee, what's the name again, diversity? Do we want to address the topic on the surface, doing some cosmetics, and then wait the next 10 years after a new crisis happens? I remember the Black Thursday or Thursday in the 90s, after this taxi man gets beaten by the police, and then we had this the most terrible riots in the history of the U.S. In the 90s, and then 10 years later, the same things happen. Like every 10 years or every 5 years, we bring some crisis remembered as of the necessity to deal definitely with the issue of racism, but beyond it, police brutality or institutional brutality. And this is where I think the debate should take place. So how in a country or in a situation with the rule of law, citizens are not equally treated, no matter access to service or experiencing the violence of the law. And there's kind of inequity regarding how state violence is exerted on some citizens. And I think this is actually what is criticized in this Black Lives Movement, but I think it's very decentralized movement. It's much more a social movement without head. So there is no agenda. So I'm sorry, there's no one to bring the agenda on the table, so that there's enough opportunity for some opportunists to bring anti-fascist topic on the agenda, or to bring all kind of very defund the police, or also definitely cancel the police. This is something to be discussed in a country with the rule of law. So is it possible? Is it reasonable? I don't think that is reasonable. What to do? Is it negotiation strategy that you have to focus on the most incredible argument to come back with a medium solution. I don't know. So yeah.
Thanks, Stefan, because you somehow recognize the fact that in our world, discussing this topic as well becomes extremely important, because you raise something that is probably the core of our discussion, the fact that diversity is promoted through the rule of law, but unfortunately you acknowledge that there is a lack of rule of law, or at least there is, as you call it, inequality in the implementation of the rule of law. And this is I think a beautiful way of thinking that in a way is promoting our work, and that means we should move into that direction, that sometimes next to our discussion on the free market, we also should rethink or go back and realize whether there is a problem with the application of the rule of law. So let's go to the US. Let's go close, and thanks Stefan for driving us there to Sydney in Connecticut. And Sydney, you already been our guest, so you know the rules here, and we appreciate you to be back to us. But first of all, is there a racism problem in the US? And as Stefan said, is there a problem of rule of law being implemented in an unfair, unequal way in the United States? And do you agree that is an American issue, but has been for some reason, like globalization, global media and so on, expanded and exploited abroad?
Yes, first of all, can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Good. I think first of all, I think we ought to separate racism from diversity. There's no question that racism continues to exist in the United States, nowhere near to the extent that it did. I mean, for one example, in 1967, 3% of all marriages in the United States were between different races. In 2016, the last number that I saw that, it was 17%. And one of my brothers is in fact married to a Black woman. I mean, so the racism exists still. And if you're a Black male and you're driving a car, you're far more likely to be pulled over than if you were a white male. That is something that we still have to live with, and over time, I think that is correcting itself, but it's going to take time. The diversity issue is a separate issue, in my opinion, because the diversity that's been promoted, not necessarily through Black Lives Matter, but the diversity that's been promoted by the progressives is one that, as Scott mentioned, is basically based on sex, on race, on ethnicity, on religion, that sort of thing. The diversity that I think of myself as a classical liberal as well. And the diversity that I think is important is the diversity of opinions and ideas. And what's happened in this country has been that there has been an emphasis on diversity of race and diversity of sex and the rest of those matters, but there has been a shutting down of diversity of opinion. And that's particularly been true in colleges and universities in this country, which is a sad thing. Because if you think about it in a way, what's important is you really want that diversity of ideas, but you also want sort of a broad unity. I mean, it's always telling to me that Abraham Lincoln, in a letter to Horace Greeley in 1862, said to him that the primary objective of the Civil War was maintaining the Union, keeping the country together. And it was a far bigger idea if you think about it, because if the Confederacy had won and they had split off, then there's a high likelihood that the United States or North America would in fact look more like South America today than having the country that we have. So it was a very important issue, but you have to be thinking very long term about that and trying to understand it. But I also wanted to go to some of your other questions. Black Lives Matter, in my opinion, is not promoting diversity. It is a part of a political movement. One of the largest funders of Black Lives movements is George Soros through his Open Society program. And politics,
don't tell me Bill Gates is engaged too, huh?
I don't know whether Gates is involved in it or not, but I wouldn't be surprised if he is. But it's part of the political movement, and all of politics is about power. It's how do you get power, and the Black Lives Movement has been utilized by the progressive left as a means of trying to bind people together as a voting bloc, and that's really, I think, as much as anything else about what it's all about. What they've done is they feed on the fragility of sort of American minds and emotions, where they can convince them that they have been privileged, which they have, and which I have been, and many other people have been, and to so therefore sort of apologize for your privilege. Well, that's sort of a silly thing to do. I mean, you don't want to necessarily apologize for your privilege. What you really want to do is to take advantage of it, and always trying to keep in mind tolerance for other people's opinions, which I think a classical liberal does, respect for people's opinions, which I think a classical liberal does, and the value and the importance of debating issues. Because if we can't debate issues, then what we do end up with is something like the 1984 scenario. And I think that's something you really want to avoid. So I think—
Don't you, sorry to interrupt, because you said something very important that in a way is bringing us also beyond the discussion here. But don't you think that as liberal, and this is also a question that I'm anticipating to Scott as well, we have been a bit naive in the sense that we have always, we have been promoting diversity, Popper, going back to all the classical liberal authors. If I think about one of the latest authors promoting pluralism, talking about Germany's Ralph Dahrendorf and the importance of pluralism, in the political debate. But don't you think that we took that for granted? Like, okay, there is a gay, fine. It's sexuality or the attitude you have is your problem. We don't care as long as we deem the rule of law. But then you said something important. Some political movements like the progressives, the leftists, took this in a sort of Marxist historical categorization. The gays, the black people, the Hispanic people. From my point of view as liberal, there is no black, there is no Hispanic. Yeah, there are people that have Hispanic roots, or people that come from Africa, or people that come from Austria, or people that have a sexual orientation of some kind. But don't you think that politically, the fact that we took this for granted in a very naive way gave the left a narrative at the very end? Because they have a narrative, and probably as liberals, we don't have a narrative.
No, I think that's true. But if you go back to the history of race in the United States is long, and a lot of it is very dark, and there's no question about that. And through the Jim Crow era, and even into it wasn't until after World War II that the armed forces were integrated, and so the whole process is taken a very long time. And affirmative action, when it was sort of put into place after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, affirmative action probably served a purpose. And in terms of trying to jumpstart the opportunity for Black Americans to get ahead and go to college and that sort of thing. But at some point, you got to remember that was 55 years ago, and over that 55 years, at some point, what happens is that affirmative action begins to become victimization, and no, I don't think any self-respecting individual, no matter their race, no matter their sex, wants to be considered a victim. They really want to be considered, they want to have the opportunity. There's also a confusion, it seems to me, that between what we think of as being freedom and what's liberal, and equality. And the equality that we really try to promote, and which Black Lives, I think, avoids the subject, is two parts to it. One is the equal rights under the law, and one can argue that some of the police actions have not been fair to Blacks in terms of equal rights under the law if they are stopped or arrested. The other part is equal rights to vote, but the other part of it is an equal opportunity, and that really goes back to the promotion of two-parent families, to the concept of education, which is a subject that's near to my heart. I mean, in terms of offering the educational opportunities. But when you start talking about equality of outcomes, then you run into a conflict with the whole concept of liberty and freedom. And they fail to sort of make those distinctions, in my opinion.
Thanks, Sidney, very much for your thoughts. Scott, I'm coming back to the question. We do the second round of, very quick, because at 45, my Austrian friends, to use the stereotype, they want me to quit. So I have to stick on time talking about stereotypes. Was
that a racist comment there, Pietro?
Yes. Toward my Austrian origins. So Scott, my question is, as liberals, we see also there is a very different background from Europe and the United States. We have to acknowledge it. There is a very different background within the same European Union. But as a big European and American and world liberal or classical liberal family, do you think we have made mistakes in this? And do you think, following Stefan, what should we do as liberals to promote diversity, pluralism within the context of the rule of law?
Well, that's once again, Pietro, thanks for the very jam-packed question.
I know, I need a manifesto from you.
Let me go about answering some aspects of it by just actually picking up on a point that Sidney made, and also piggybacking on some of the points that he made. As he pointed out, no one wants to be treated as a victim, and I think that that's actually a really good point. There's something somewhat perverse about the way this debate has been unfolding. Namely, I saw, for example, several weeks ago, the CNN anchor Don Lemon was speaking to Chris Cuomo, I believe, and at one point he more or less says, Blacks are, passive, they're the victims in everything that's going on here, and it's up to the people in power to do something about it. Who are the people in power? Well, white people are. There's this weird sense in which Blacks are rendered entirely passives, and we're back to a world of just purely white agency. And I don't think that's a very healthy way of debating this problem at all. To get to your question, have we as classical liberals been naive? Well, I mean, to one extent, perhaps we're victims of our own success. I mean, classical liberalism has led to a great deal of prosperity and freedom for everybody, and it's corruption in any sort of regime, as Plato will tell you, is inevitable, even in Callipolis. I think classical liberals suffer from a rather unique problem in that what binds classical liberal regimes together are what might be called, let's say, the negative virtues, simply respect for rule of law. But respect for rule of law is not really all that inspiring. And that's one of the reasons why I think something like socialism, with its emphasis on unity, with its sort of quasi-Christian messianic approach with history, with the idea of a chosen people, whether it be the proletariat in Marx's version, or whether it be, let's say, Black people in Black Lives Matter, is always far more inspiring and always will be more inspiring. I think for classical liberals, it's much better to have a narrative like that of the founding fathers, something that understands that humans and human institutions are indeed very imperfect, and yet that our eyes should be carried upwards, as opposed to something like the 1619 narrative, which seems really, when I look at something like that, I'm sort of reminded of, you'll appreciate this, Pietro, and Dante and Virgil in the Inferno. They're walking through hell, and it's an incredibly static place. It's full of punishment with absolutely no regard for any progress, let's say, that's been made from the past, and absolutely no hope of a brighter future. It's an eternal damnation of the present. And one of the ironies of, let's say, when some rioters and vandals pull down a statue of Thomas Jefferson, is they pull down a statue of a man whose words provide the very bulwark, the very foundation of their criticism of American society. And it would seem to me that if one wishes to reform a society, be it American or otherwise, one must begin by loving that society and having gratitude for everything that the society has done. I mean, it's ironic what Sydney had just mentioned earlier, the statistics he brought up about interracial marriage from the late 60s up until 2016, that would show that in that field, a great deal of progress has been made. And of course, that doesn't mean we should rest on our laurels. There's always more that can and should be done. But it's kind of ironic that some progressive intellectuals are remarkably reluctant to speak of any sort of progress at all. As for us as classical liberals, I mean, I think as we've established thus far, an emphasis on diversity of thought and opinion is of the utmost importance. And I think that diversity requires liberty, particularly freedom of speech, because what issues from that are the fruits of civilization. And on the level of ideas, I think that this true diversity of thought and opinion, is promoted by defending freedom of speech and also openness to other people's opinions. And so I think that the intellectual generosity of a man like Friedrich August von Hayek is an admirable example. I mean, as Joseph Schumpeter said, he never accused anyone of anything worse than intellectual error. And I think that if we seek to convince our interlocutor of anything, then we must convince him that we take him seriously and that he is our friend. And Sydney had spoken of Abraham Lincoln before, and I'd like to quote briefly Lincoln once more. We have to convince our interlocutor that he's our friend, and therein is a drop of honey that catches his heart, which, say what he will, is the great high road to his reason.
Yes, thank you very much for this meaningful thought. And you know, behind you, there's this in your background, disruptive innovation, and you know, it's for freedom of speech that we get disruptive ideas, and through the debate that we can build more and more knowledge. You mentioned von Hayek. We can mention another great Austrian thinker, Karl Popper, and the fact that we need to create a conflict of ideas. Before coming to Sydney, because I have a question from Alex, and I'll take the question for last. I want to go back to Stefan and Mary, but first to Mary. Mary, also from your privileged position in the UK, how do you think we can promote as classical liberal? And again, as liberal, we created the word liberal, now we have to call ourselves classical liberal. We're liberals, it's the Americans have been copying us. How do we promote diversity?
Here in the UK, remembering that once again I am an American and spent all of my, up until I was 24, continuously in the United States. Since then I spent most of my time abroad. The conversations of diversity are very connected to privilege. They are connected to ideas of attendance at elite universities, working in elite professions, and engaging in elite cultural activities. At this time, to tell the truth, I am not sure that anything can be done from a classical liberal perspective. Both in the US and here in the UK, there are plenty of resources available that would promote social mobility, regardless of race. Scholarships to the elite universities, for example, in New York, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, is free admission. Within these opportunities, I believe that everything that can be done in a way that does not impede freedom has been done. Obviously, the current climate is to ask for or rather to demand a more authoritarian approach with requests for X amount percentage of student bodies to be composed of X minority. And I believe that I have no doubt that for all of us, such an approach is not the classical liberal approach.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Mary. And this is great also because you do something beautiful that is music, and music is probably one of the best tools for promoting, diversity and promoting freedom of thoughts. Stefan and Sine, we're really running out of time. Stefan, this is not a question that we plan, and I know I usually go into questions that we don't plan, but it's it's the enthusiasm for the debate. But earlier you mentioned about the rule of law and the fact that we fail with the rule of law. What should we do instead to make sure that we don't fail with the rule of law?
Yes, good question. I think maybe before answering that question regarding the classical liberal, how they fail or how they were sleeping, I think they were so, I would say, obsessed about bureaucratization and how to diminish the growth of government and so, and then they forgot that this is where actually most of the implementation of the rule of law take place. So they abandoned that field to the liberal in the US term. And secondly, comparing liberals and classical liberals, I would say, so the left is in a modus of perpetual struggle. This is why they're still inventive and trying to find new struggle fields. And the classical liberal, as you mentioned, were sleeping on the success and were not enough imaginative or innovative to adapt to the change of the time. So how to improve diversity, actually, it's simple. So to be much more an agenda setter, so to fill the content of public policy with much more engagement, and also even within the classical liberal tradition to have a very inclusive, a very diverse opinions, accepting the diversity of opinion regarding the market, regarding the state, regarding taxation, being much more pragmatic, because at the end, the political arena is in daily motion, so that people need to get very innovative and to adapt to the change. And I think this is where classical liberals fail, actually, to be close to the citizen and not being very in some kind of ivory tower, but to fill public policy with content, not very abstract content.
Thanks, Stefan. Sine, very, very quickly, because we are out of time and it's my fault. But as I said earlier, just of stereotyping, I'm Italian, so I can only run out of time. There's a question that comes from Alexander. It's a very long question. I read off of this. The state of Afro-Americans families, so it's a very American question, seems to be in the whole quite broken. 7 out of 10 children are born outside marriage. 40% of prisoners are male Black compared to the 7% in the population. Why is that? Could be a question of education, but we go back to the original issue. This Black Lives Movement is created also within the education system. Is there anything that we can do, again, as classical liberal, into the education system?
I think that those statistics are all right, from what I understand. The only answer, it seems to me, is to promote two-parent families, and somehow the government ought to do that. For example, Barack Obama had the perfect opportunity as a son of an African American and a Caucasian woman. He was born, he grew up and then married an African American woman, and they had raised two daughters. And as a family unit, they did everything exactly right. But during his time in office, none of that was promoted. And it's a cultural thing as much as anything else. The educational part of it, government can certainly work at, because they can do more to promote choice in schools and all that sort of thing. But it goes back to the family, and it goes back to some of these, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ended up having the sort of the perverse effect of causing families to split up. And it's a very unfortunate thing. But these one-parent families get promoted in Hollywood by entertainment people. You know, it's a cultural thing, and I'm not sure exactly how we have to address it, but we do need to address it because it's fundamental to the problem.
Thanks, Sidney. Thanks to Scott very much. Thanks to Stefan, and thanks to Mary Lucia for your comments and your thoughts in helping us to tackling a small part of this gigantic discussion that we should have. You know, my dream is to go back to a real symposium and to have a live, vibrant discussion, face-to-face, one against one, in a conflictual but constructive way. You mentioned Austrians and German authors and American authors. Let me mention the first Italian president, and he was a very solid liberal author. President Luigi Einaudi said, the only thing we could do to solve problems is to work hard and harder day after day, moment after moment. That's the only way we can help fixing problems. And I think that's what we're trying to do here with this small debate. Thanks to everybody that's been following us here in Zoom. Thanks to everybody that's been following us on Facebook. And thanks to everybody that will follow us and will help us enhancing the debate and the discussion that at the very end is knowledge. Thanks again to the fabulous four speakers, Stefan, Mary, Sidney, and Scott. And please have a look to the Free Market Road show for next events, the Austrian Economics and Competere for our next events. And please share as much as events you guys do around Europe, because we're happy to follow and they will help us in improving the debate. Thanks, everybody. See you very soon then. Ciao.
Thanks.
Thanks, Pietro.